Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into something really fundamental, maybe a bit obsessive. The actual mechanics behind how the biggest fortunes in history were built.
Yeah, we're not just looking at the shiny surface, the end products or the public image.
Right. Our mission isn't really about celebrating these titans. It's more about understanding the specific strategies, sometimes pretty intense ones, they used to get and keep their empires.
Well, exactly. We're looking under the hood at the blueprints of massive wealth. Because when you really study the people who became the richest in the world, the stories we usually hear, the steel mills, the software, that's just the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
The real engine is often this almost obsessive drive for control, mastering systems, sometimes exploiting inefficiencies, and frankly, some pretty contradictory personality traits that let them operate, let's say, outside the usual rules.
And the sources we're drawing on give us this amazing span, right? We can compare how someone like Rockefeller did it in the age of oil and steam versus how it happens now with high-speed finance, global tech platforms. It's really a deep dive into how control itself has evolved.
Precisely. And you see this really fundamental shift. The early wealth, think Rockefeller, think Carnegie, it was built on, well, patience, but also ruthlessness, consolidating industries, controlling the physical stuff, pipelines, railroads.
Tangible assets.
Tangible assets, exactly. Whereas modern fortunes, often driven by crazy leverage, sheer market speed, and this kind of psychological, almost end-to-end control over digital worlds, over information flow.
So it's like the difference between controlling, say, how oil gets distributed and controlling how fast money moves, or the very architecture of the market.
That's a great way to put it. Controlling the commodity versus controlling the velocity and structure of capital itself.
Okay, let's start there then, Section 1, the foundations of industrial wealth. Patience and ruthlessness, as you said. And we really have to begin with John D. Rockefeller, the calculated architect.
Rockefeller is just such a fascinating paradox. He built Standard Oil into this behemoth, right? Controlling something like 90% of U.S. oil refining at its peak.
Incredible dominance.
Yet his public persona was deliberately low-key, the provincial businessman. Our sources mention him arriving at the office almost unnoticed, like he had a, quote, code of invisibility.
Yeah. I read that detail about him jotting notes in pencil on his left cuff during his commute. Not even a proper notebook.
Right. It speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About efficiency, minimizing any visible extravagance. He was also quietly, very devoutly Baptist. Stuck to his roots even when he became massively wealthy, unlike others who, as Mencken Riley observed, tended to climb the golden ramparts of the nearest Episcopal church to signal they'd arrived.
So that invisibility, it was a kind of strategic camouflage for this intense control.
Absolutely. And the real genius, the real ruthlessness, wasn't just in refining, it was in mastering logistics. That's where Standard Oil really flexed its muscles.
Tell us about that, the strategy in the oil fields.
Yeah. Okay, so when oil was struck in Bradford, Pennsylvania, it was a classic boom. Standard Oil needed to maintain its grip on distribution through its pipelines. So they sent in Daniel O'Day's teams. And it was described as just this bravura performance.
What did they do?
Their goal was staggering. They aimed to connect 5 new wells a day to their pipeline network.
5 a day.
5 a day, while simultaneously throwing up these massive tank farms to store the surplus oil, because production was just exploding.
And did they manage it?
Oh, yeah. Storage capacity in Bradford ballooned from maybe 1 million barrels to 4.5 million in just 8 months. But here's the thing. The producers, just like in earlier booms, they kept drilling like crazy, way beyond what the system could actually handle.
History repeating itself.
Totally. So when their oil started literally spilling onto the ground because there was nowhere to store it, they didn't blame overproduction. They blamed Standard Oil, cried malevolent conspiracy.
And that wasn't just talk, right? It led to legal trouble.
Very serious legal trouble. In 1879, a grand jury down in Clarion County, Pennsylvania, did something pretty extraordinary. They indicted Rockefeller himself, along with other Standard Oil execs.
On what charges?
Conspiracy. Conspiracy to monopolize the oil business and, crucially, conspiracy to extort rebates from the railroads, basically using the criminal law to try and break the monopoly.
But Rockefeller, the quiet man in New York, he wasn't touched.
Exactly. And this is key to how these fortunes sometimes work. Because Rockefeller lived outside Pennsylvania, he was legally shielded. He couldn't be easily extradited or prosecuted there. The Standard officials who did live in Pennsylvania, They were arrested.
Wow. So using jurisdictional boundaries as a defense mechanism.
Precisely. It shows how structuring your operations, even where you physically reside, can be just as powerful a tool as building a pipeline. Legal strategy becomes paramount.
And even internally, his focus was relentless. The sources mention this rivalry for the top spot between Henry Rogers and John Archbold. Why did Rockefeller pick Archbold?
It boiled down to focus. Rogers was brilliant, no doubt. But he had, let's say, divided loyalties. He was deeply involved in competing gas interests on the side.
Okay.
And he was apparently willing to hurt Standard Oil's bottom line somewhat to basically starve out his gas competitors. For Rockefeller, that was unforgivable. A cardinal sin, the source calls it.
Why sin?
Because Standard Oil was the system. Its consolidation, its overall profitability was everything. Rogers threatening that for a side project, unacceptable. Rockefeller demanded absolute, unwavering focus on Standard's dominance. Archbold offered that. Rogers didn't.
That singular focus on the core system, it makes sense. But it contrasts really interestingly with our next titan, Andrew Carnegie. Also built an industrial empire, steel obviously, but his idea of control seemed to morph, didn't it, into something more global.
Yeah, Carnegie's a different beast. Around 1898, he starts signaling he's ready to get out of steel. It wasn't just about cashing out. He told his partners, Frick and Phipps, he was prepared to sell his shares if the right offer came along.
Why then?
Because he was already deeply involved in other things. Philanthropy, yes, but also grander political concerns. He saw himself moving onto a world stage.
Specifically peace and arbitration, right? Trying to prevent wars.
Exactly. He became obsessed with influencing U.S. foreign policy. He was constantly back and forth to Washington, advising President Theodore Roosevelt. His big push was to get Roosevelt to invite nations, starting with Great Britain, to sign binding treaties of arbitration, to settle disputes without fighting.
So using his industrial fortune to reshape international relations.
That was the goal. He saw himself as a statesman. But this led to a really fascinating clash with Roosevelt, which kind of shows the potential arrogance that comes with that level of wealth and influence.
Yes, the conflict over the Navy.
Right. Roosevelt, around mid-November, starts hinting he wants to significantly increase the size of the U.S. Navy. Carnegie sees this as a complete betrayal of the arbitration idea he'd been championing.
And he felt, what, deep anxiety?
Deep anxiety, yeah. And he didn't just express concern privately. He sent Roosevelt this absolutely blistering letter, basically challenging the president's consistency and character.
What did he say?
He warned Roosevelt that reversing course on naval expansion would make him look either frightened, implying weakness, or, maybe worse, like an impulsive, excitable ruler who don't know one year what he desires the next.
Wow, he actually said that to the President of the United States.
He did. Think about the audacity.
Yeah?
He's essentially saying, Mr. President, I have influence over public perception, and if you cross me on this policy, I will paint you as erratic and unstable.
That's a whole other level of control, not just infrastructure, but trying to control the narrative, the character of a leader.
It really shows the intoxicating effect, doesn't it? Rockefeller controlled the pipes. Carnegie aimed to control geopolitics and a president's image. Very different expressions of power born from industrial might.
Okay, so if the Gilded Age was about controlling physical stuff, let's jump forward. Section 2. Financial speed, leverage, and arbitrage. This is where Wall Street figures out how to make money from money, often using debt as a weapon.
Right. And the mechanics get way more complex, more abstract. The leveraged buyout, the LBO, which really took off in the 1980s, is the perfect example of this new game.
So break down the LBO for us. How did it work?
Okay, so basically an LBO is where a small group, often the company's existing senior managers, team up with a Wall Street firm, think KKR back then, or Drexel, Burnham, Lambert.
Right.
They propose to buy the entire company from its public shareholders. But here's the kicker. They don't use much of their own money. They finance the purchase by borrowing massive amounts, usually through high-yield bonds, what people started calling junk bonds.
And the collateral for all that debt
Is the assets of the very company they're buying. So the company itself takes on this huge debt load, often like 90% of the purchase price, just so the management group can take it private.
Which is why critics famously called it stealing the company from its owners.
That was the big controversy, exactly. Critics saw it as creating these unstable mountains of corporate debt. But the defenders, the LBO firms and managers, they argued it imposed discipline, forced companies to cut costs, sell off unproductive parts, become lean and mean to make those huge debt payments.
But the executives doing the deal weren't primarily motivated by making the company lean, were they?
Let's be honest, probably not. Their main motivation was that they got a huge slice of the equity in the newly private company for a relatively tiny upfront investment. If they could manage the debt and later sell the company or take it public again, they became instantly unbelievably wealthy. Filthy rich, as the source puts it.
And the scale of these deals just exploded. The RJR Nabisco fight is legendary. Project Peach.
Oh, RJR Nabisco, that was the peak, the moment everyone realized just how huge and, frankly, how brutal this could get. When the management team, led by Ross Johnson, launched their own LBO attempt.
Yeah.
KKR, the competing LBO firm led by Henry Kravis, felt they immediately had to consider sending a bear hug letter to the RJR board.
A bear hug? What's that?
It's an unsolicited takeover offer made directly to the board, usually at a high premium, designed to force them to negotiate or risk shareholder lawsuits. KKR needed to get access to the company's confidential financial data to even make a competing bid.
So immediate aggression just to get in the game.
Total aggression.
Yeah.
There was this palpable anxiety, even within KKR, that the bidding war, the auction, would go right to the edge of the envelope, push financial sanity to its limits. It wasn't just business, it felt like war.
And the sources mention Ross Johnson's lavish spending, his cookie jar being full, suggesting management knew there was hidden value they could unlock for themselves.
Absolutely. But none of these massive LBOs, none of this restructuring would have been possible without the incredible money machine built by Michael Milken out in Beverly Hills.
Right, Milken and Drexel Burnham Lambert, the junk bond king.
He fundamentally changed how capital was raised in America. Before Milken, high-yield bonds were a niche, almost disreputable market. Milken saw an opportunity. He operated with this intense energy. One observer apparently wondered if he was on medication, and he built relationships.
With whom?
He famously boasted about bringing together all these pools of capital. He went to regional pension funds, insurance companies, savings and loans institutions that traditionally only bought safe, investment-grade bonds.
And he convinced them to buy junk.
He did. He persuaded them that the higher yields on these bonds more than compensated for the higher risk, especially in a diversified portfolio. He essentially created a massive new market, a whole new ecosystem for a high-yield debt.
So he wasn't just financing deals, he created the means to finance them on an unprecedented scale.
Exactly. This new river of capital he controlled gave him, and the LBO firms he worked with, buying power unlike anything the world had seen before. They could target huge companies for hostile takeovers and LBOs that would have been unthinkable just years earlier.
And the rewards were astronomical.
Legendary. In 1986 alone, Milken's high-yield department at Drexel reportedly earned something like $700 million in bonuses. He wasn't just a banker, he was like the sun god, as one book called him, of this new financial structure, dictating terms because he controlled the flow of debt.
Okay, so that's leveraging capital through debt. But the digital age brought another kind of leverage: speed and information. The sources mention the SEC getting suspicious about insider trading, particularly around SE Capital and Steve Cohen.
Right. The suspicion there revolved around a pattern. People connected to Cohen's firm, SE's Capital, seemed to be buying up stock in specific companies. The examples given are Warner Communications, General Foods, Union Carbide, just shortly before public announcements of takeovers were made.
Classic insider trading accusations, using non-public info.
Exactly. That's the illegal side of exploiting an information edge. You know something the market doesn't, and you trade on it before the news breaks.
But there's a more systemic, often legal way this information edge evolved, right? This obsession with sheer speed, high-frequency trading, HFT.
Oh, absolutely. HFT takes the idea of an information edge to an extreme. The source quotes someone saying that in that world, traders would sell their grandmothers for a microsecond.
A microsecond. 1/1,000,000th of a second.
Think about that. The entire business model of many HFT firms is built on shaving off microseconds, even nanoseconds, in getting market data and executing trades. They spend billions laying fiber optic cables in the straightest possible lines between Chicago and New York, building microwave towers.
Just to be faster.
Just to be milliseconds faster than competitors. It's not about fundamental research on whether a stock is good value. It's about seeing the market, quote, fractionally sooner, allowing them to, for example, jump ahead of large institutional orders or profit from tiny, fleeting price differences across different exchanges. It's a technological arms race for speed.
And the speed advantage gets exploited in complex ways, especially with these things called dark pools.
Right. Dark pools are private trading venues, usually run by big banks or brokers, where large institutional orders can be traded away from the public stock exchanges. They're meant to allow big players to trade large blocks without immediately moving the market price against them.
But the source mentions an outsider, Brad, noticing something fishy.
Yeah, this character Brad, described as a Wall Street outsider, he starts noticing trades happening in a weird way. He realizes that some big banks aren't sending their customers' orders out to the public exchanges where they might get the best possible price.
Why not? Where were the orders going?
They were keeping them inside their own dark pools. They'd price the orders aggressively within their pool, but crucially, they weren't letting them interact with the wider market immediately.
Why would a bank do that? Isn't their job to get the best price for the customer?
Well, that's the conflict. They had other motives. Maybe they wanted to boost the trading volume stats for their own dark pool to make it look more attractive to other clients. Or, perhaps more cynically, they could charge HFT firms fees for privileged access to see and trade against that order flow within their pool before it hit the public market.
So they're basically hiding customer orders from the open market for their own benefit.
That's the allegation. By internalizing these orders, they deliberately avoided letting the full force of that buying or selling pressure be seen publicly.
And the source calls this failure to route orders fairly the prelude to a symphony of scalping. How does that work? How does hiding the order lead to scalping?
Because the HFT firms, with their speed advantage and direct connections into these dark pools, could see what was happening inside the bank's private venue. They could detect the buying or selling pressure there before the public market fully registered it.
Ah, I see.
This gave them a crucial few milliseconds. They could then race out to the public exchanges and buy or sell ahead of the wave, capturing that tiny price difference when the market eventually caught up. The bank's failure to expose the order created a predictable, exploitable inefficiency.
So the banks create the inefficiency and the HFTs profit from it.
Essentially, yes. The HFTs scalp these tiny profits millions of times a day, turning the structural flaws, sometimes deliberately created by the banks, into billions. It shifted from controlling pipelines, like Rockefeller, to controlling the actual architecture and signaling of the market itself.
That is a profound shift. Okay, let's pivot in section 3. Modern wealth through scale and really intense customer control. Starting with someone maybe less expected in this context, Sam Walton.
Walton's interesting because his philosophy seems so simple, but its execution was utterly relentless. His core principle from day one at Walmart was keeping our costs as low as possible, always, so they could always promise the lowest prices.
And this wasn't just a slogan, it was deeply ingrained.
Absolutely, it drove everything. The source has this fantastic anecdote about their early advertising efforts.
Tell me about it.
Walton and his managers would literally buy newspapers from nearby bigger cities like Dallas or Little Rock. They'd sit on the floor with scissors, cut out pictures of items. They also sold motor oil, toothpaste, whatever.
Seriously, cut and paste.
Cut and paste. They'd stick them onto their own ad layout and just wrote in these real hot prices, like toothpaste for 16 cents a tube, prices nobody could touch.
Why so cheap? Loss leaders.
Exactly. Just to drive traffic, get people in the door. It shows this incredibly hands-on, frugal, almost scrappy approach to cost control that was baked in from the very beginning.
That's amazing. But as Walmart became this global behemoth, Walton himself seemed worried about that scale, didn't he?
He did. He expressed this continuous anxiety, this fear that Walmart would become just another centrally driven chain. He worried there'd be no room for creativity, that the necessary rules and bureaucracy of a giant corporation would crush the entrepreneurial spirit.
The maverick merchant spirit he started with.
Precisely. He wrestled with that tension. How do you maintain discipline and efficiency at massive scale without killing the very drive that got you there?
That tension feels very relevant to the tech giants, too, people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Managing scale while trying to maintain a specific vision or control.
Absolutely. Take Bill Gates. Yeah. Intellectually, he was apparently off the charts. The source describes him as a student at Harvard who could easily stump the teacher in graduate-level math classes like theory of computation, just loved complex logical problems.
A true tech prodigy.
For sure. But here's the interesting part. The sources emphasize that Microsoft didn't survive its early, precarious years just on brilliant coding.
What else was needed?
Grind. Sheer, tireless salesmanship from Gates himself. He was the one making the cold calls, hammering out deals, persuading hardware companies to use their software, convincing clients. He wasn't just the chief architect. He was the chief salesman, negotiator, and enforcer. That relentless drive to sell and win was just as critical as the code.
And then you have Steve Jobs. His path to control seems rooted in something different, this unwavering, almost obsessive vision of perfection.
Yeah, Jobs saw product development, user experience, design. It was all intertwined, almost like art. His famous move was hitting the rewind button, as the source calls it. If something wasn't absolutely perfect in his eyes, they'd go back, rework it.
Regardless of deadlines or cost.
Seemingly so.
Yeah.
Whether it was fundamental changes to the character of Woody in the early days of Pixar's Toy Story, or insisting on redesigning the casing for the original Macintosh again and again, his belief was that any compromise, any imperfection allowed now, would permanently mar the final product and the user's experience.
And that philosophy, that need for control over the experience, really culminated in the iPhone App Store, didn't it?
The App Store was described as an absolutely magical solution to a huge problem for Apple. How do you leverage the creativity of thousands of outside software developers without losing control over your device and the user experience?
Which was paramount for Jobs.
Utterly paramount. So the App Store let them do both. It empowered legions of developers to build apps, creating immense value for the iPhone platform. But Apple retained strict end-to-end control.
Ow.
Every app had to be submitted to Apple, tested against their standards, and distributed only through their store. They could reject apps that were buggy, malicious, or didn't meet their design or content guidelines.
So they got the benefits of an open ecosystem, but with a very tightly controlled gate.
Exactly. It protected the integrity of the iPhone, protected the customer experience from bad actors or just bad software, and, not incidentally, gave Apple a cut of the revenue. It's perhaps the ultimate example of achieving massive scale while maintaining meticulous control over the entire ecosystem. Rockefeller controlled the physical pipeline, Jobs controlled the digital one, right down to the user's screen.
That brings us perfectly to Section 4, where this drive for control goes beyond business strategy and becomes, well, deeply personal, sometimes verging on the pathological. Let's start with Howard Hughes.
Hughes is such a classic case study in image creation and later extreme isolation. Early on, he deliberately crafted this public persona, the corporate Superman.
How so?
He made sure everyone knew he didn't just own companies, he put his personal imprint on everything. He famously test flew the experimental aircraft his company built, sometimes crashing them. He directed the Hollywood movies he produced. The image was one of hands-on daredevil genius involved in every facet.
Omnipotent, almost.
That was the goal. But later in life, as we know, this control manifested as extreme withdrawal, total isolation from the world. Yet interestingly, the sources suggest that even in that isolation, his mind, his ability to analyze people, remained incredibly sharp.
Even when he wasn't seeing people face to face.
Apparently so. There's this amazing anecdote where he's communicating only through memos with his top aide, Robert Maheu. Maheu messes up a potential deal and offers Hughes this long, elaborate excuse, a rationalization.
Hughes.
Hughes sees right through it. He writes back this cutting memo saying, essentially, Bob, stop making excuses. And then he adds this line, sometimes I think you have an idea that I am about 12 years on this world instead of 62.
Wow. Still assessing psychology, even from seclusion.
Exactly. His ability to detect BS, to exert psychological control, was still there, even when the physical man was hidden away.
Okay, another figure known for control, but in a very different way. William Randolph Hearst. His pathology seems tied to haggling, despite being incredibly wealthy.
Yeah, Hearst is fascinating. Built this media empire, hugely influential politically, sometimes championing reform causes. But when it came to his own finances, especially his legendary art and antique collecting, he had this method.
Which was?
He almost never paid cash up front for his vast purchases. Instead, he'd offer sellers his personal notes, basically fancy IOUs, signed by him, maybe accruing some interest, but it was still just a promise to pay later.
And this was a mixed blessing for the sellers. Why mixed? Sounds risky.
Hugely risky, because, as the source states, Hearst made a business of holding people off for years and then settling on his own terms. He'd get the priceless tapestry or the antique armor immediately by signing a note, but then he'd drag out the payment for ages.
Using his wealth as leverage even after the deal was done.
Exactly. He controlled the payment timeline completely. Sellers might wait years, constantly chasing the debt, and then Hearst might finally offer to settle for less than the originally agreed price, knowing they were desperate for cash. He used his liquidity as a weapon after the acquisition.
And this reputation followed him.
It certainly did. There's this telling anecdote from an art dealer in Spain that Hearst's architect, Julia Morgan, was trying to buy from. Hearst sends a cable, BYETC, assuming his name is enough, but the Spanish dealer refuses. writes back basically saying Mr. Hearst is utterly unknown in Spain. Not literally unknown, of course, but his credit was unknown,
Yeah.
or rather his reputation for not paying promptly was known. He couldn't just buy on credit there like he did elsewhere. His pathological payment habits damaged his ability to operate internationally, despite his fame and fortune.
Just incredible. Finally, let's look at Robert Moses. Here, the pathology seems to be about power itself.
Moses is maybe the most chilling example of how the pursuit of power can become the end goal. The sources suggest he had this innate arrogance, a powerful intellect, but also an unusually strong susceptibility to the addiction of power.
Initially, though, he used that power for big public projects, right? Parks, highways.
Yes, initially power was the means to achieve his vision for transforming New York's infrastructure. He was granted immense authorities by reformers and the legislature precisely because he seemed like the guy who could get things done, cut through red tape.
But then a shift happened.
A crucial shift. People started noticing, as one source puts it, a sense of dominating authority and a desire to have his own way in all matters. He began seeking power for its own sake, as an end in itself.
And the irony is,
The incredible irony is that the very legal structures and powers that reformers had helped grant him things like the consolidation of park authorities. He eventually turned against those same reformers.
how so?
When people who had initially supported him later tried to question or stop some of his specific plans, like, say, cutting down irreplaceable trees in Inwood Hill Park for a highway approach,
Yeah.
they discovered they had legally stripped themselves of any power to intervene. The laws they had championed had given Moses virtually unchecked authority over the details of planning and construction within his domain. He had architected his power base so effectively that even his former allies couldn't touch him on the specifics.
He understood the structure of power itself was the ultimate control.
Absolutely. He knew that controlling the rules of the game, the institutional levers, was more important than just having money or popular support at any given moment. It rendered him untouchable for decades.
So wrapping this all up,
Yeah.
we've seen this journey from controlling physical things like pipelines
Right, Rockefeller.
to controlling financial architecture, speed, and leverage,
Milken, HFT, the LBO kings,
to controlling the entire digital customer experience.
Jobs, and the App Store.
And finally, these almost pathological levels of personal and institutional control.
Hughes, Hearst, Moses,
Yeah.
and the common thread, really, across all these eras, all these different fields, seems to be this obsessive, sometimes deeply ingrained focus on control.
Control over what, specifically?
Control over everything possible. Over costs, like Walden. Over logistics, like Rockefeller. Over information flow and speed. Over the terms of deals, like Hearst. Over the user experience, like Jobs. Over the levers of political power, like Moses. The goal always seems to be to eliminate uncertainty, eliminate external interference, and enforce their singular vision or will.
And it feels like once fortunes or power reach that kind of massive scale, they almost inevitably start operating outside or maybe above the normal constraints, commercial rules, moral norms, sometimes even legal jurisdictions.
That certainly seems to be a pattern, which raises really big questions about governance, doesn't it, when individuals or entities become that powerful? The sources touch on this idea, referencing proposals for something like a global progressive tax on extreme wealth.
Based on net worth.
Yeah, based on net worth, like the list Forbes and others already publish. Imagine, say, a small percentage tax, but one that ramps up significantly for the truly enormous fortunes, maybe 5% or even 10%, annually on assets over €1 billion, for example.
That would require incredible transparency globally.
It would. But the provocative question it raises is, if you had such a system, imposing a real escalating cost on just passively holding that level of concentrated wealth and power, would it be enough? Would it counteract this tendency towards extreme, sometimes pathological control that seems to arise when fortunes become so large they transcend ordinary societal limits?
Or is that drive for total control the kind that leads to Hughes's isolation or Hearst's haggling or Moses's power addiction? Is that just an unavoidable psychological side effect of operating at a scale where the normal rules simply don't feel like they apply anymore?
That's the deep, unsettling question, isn't it? Does that level of wealth inevitably reshape the psychology of the person who holds it, making extreme control not just a strategy, but a necessity in their minds? Something for all of us, maybe, to think about.